All right, well, we are recording. Zach, you all set to go?
Yeah, so I know Sarah Beth said she'd be right back. So I don't, if it's just two of us, we can wait just a second, I think. I don't want to, since she said she'd just be a second, let's just give it 1 minute to make sure. Perfect. She's back. Great. So this can be incredibly informal, but I will just tell you a little bit about my background and then kind of what I do now in Washington with climate change and environmental policy. Sarah Beth, I haven't had a chance to meet you before. I know Darla very well from my Del Valle experience, but I grew up on a small livestock farm in southern New Jersey. My mom's been a 4-H leader 20 years. I went to Del Valle for 3 years, and then I left college. I dropped out. My grandma got sick and ultimately passed away. And then I went back to college later in life in 2011. And then when I graduated school, I had built a really great relationship with Russell Redding, who had been my dean, and he hired me. And I worked for him at Del Valle for about 18 months, doing a sustainable garden, on the Rolfe campus. And why I was doing that, I had taken my LSATs. I think I might go to law school then. And then I called a bunch of law schools, and none of them really had a pro ag outlook in my experience at the time. And then I had a great opportunity to go to Pennsylvania Department of Ag and run the PA Preferred program, which was really cool. I got to go out and really work with farmers and do the marketing stuff. And then Secretary Redding would come back and ask me to do his ag tourism program or the fair program. I worked with all the 4-H FA chapters and all the 109 fairs. I did that. And then I went to law school at Dickinson, Penn State Dickinson Law in Carlisle. That was 2017. And that was really kind of this great moment of being able to tie all my life ag experiences and different things with policy and regulatory. I specialized in environmental law and regulatory policy. My first year summer, I interned at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, which is the largest water nonprofit. Frankly, to be candid, I think I wanted to work there because they're kind of anti-ag in some ways, or at least their litigation strategy has always been that way. So I wanted to kind of get a sense of how environmental groups were looking at litigating against farm operations, to kind of get a sense of like, is this purely a legal issue? Is there a storytelling component? Is it a policy issue? Which was a wonderful experience. I'm really grateful for it. And then I was also a research associate or assistant for the National Ag Law Center in Arkansas with Harrison Pittman. I got to work on some really cool environmental issues there and do some statewide compilations. And then my last semester at law school, I worked at a law firm, Olson, Frank and Wida, where I had the great honor to work with Secretary Jack Block, who had been the Secretary of Agriculture for the United States under Ronald Reagan, and Marshall Matz, who had been the chief of staff for George McGovern during his presidential run. And I graduated in 2020 in the middle of the pandemic. I thought I was going to go back and work for Russell, and the government was on a hiring freeze, so I needed to find a job. And the National Association of State Departments of Ag was hiring, and I stepped on there, and I kind of led their climate change, natural resources and environment, all their Clean Water Act 404, all their EPA Clean Air Act stuff, the water rule, and then climate change work. And then 8 weeks ago, I had gotten a phone call from the National Council of Farmer Cooperatives to see if I'd be willing to step in and lead their climate change work. So that's what I do now. Some of the prominent Pennsylvania farmer co-ops would be Nouse, Land O'Lakes, Dairy Farmers of America, Ocean Spray Cranberries. The New Holland Livestock Barns are actually part of a larger marketing co-op, but they're another one as well, which is really, really cool. So that's kind of like just the general journey piece. And then some of my day-to-day work now, I'm currently 2 blocks off the United States Senate here by Union Station. My day-to-day work is really involving going to the Hill and talking to policymakers about how conservation work and environmental policy is affecting farmers and the supply chain. One project I recently worked on with the Food and Ag Climate Alliance was to craft this pilot program. It's called the Climate Smart Partnerships Program. The United States Department of Ag just put about $3 billion into it to fund outcomes from farmers to either do carbon sequestration or to do riparian buffers or things that would have a net climate smart benefit. And one of the cool things about that process was I was working on a coalition with the Environmental Defense Fund, again, the organization's kind of always been on the opposite side of the V in a court case, and then Nature Conservancy, and really trying to figure out how the traditional farm community can work with these environmental groups to kind of get these shared outcomes while also having keep producers in business. So that's a lot of my day-to-day work. I do go around the country a lot and speak on these issues too, and try to get stuff from producers about like, hey, y'all know farmers a lot of times maybe not talk about climate change the way academics or even policymakers do, but traditionally they are still talking about soil erosion, how vegetation, whether that be cover crops or trees or buffers, provide value to their farm, or just even how water moves to their soil colloids. So those are all transferable things in the policy piece. Again, I want to be helpful and provide value to both of you. So whether that's significant court cases or regulation, or just where I have a farm bill that's about to happen here in a year, and we're already gearing up for that. Whatever I can do to share or have a dialogue, I just wanted to give you some ground, kind of my background.
Yeah, hi, Zach. So this is the first year that I have an Ag and Natural Resources class. And so when I saw this topic, I was like, oh, that would be really interesting to talk to my students a little bit more about laws and like how that they definitely understand that there are regulations and that there are things that we can't do in agriculture. But just having never like taught a course like this before, I wasn't sure, like, are there topics that you think are important that high schoolers should understand in regards to policy and law?
Yeah, so you'll know the best way to engage your students. There are some very practical ones like right to farm. So local laws. So right to farm is something we constantly talk about in agriculture, but really what it is it's a protection and immunity against nuisance law. So like if your neighbors are being loud or noisy, you have a right of action to be able to say like, hey, this is a nuisance, please knock it off. And that's traditionally how people who move through the country have been able to, attack, I shouldn't say attack, that's too strong of a word, but basically tell farmers to, hey, you can't make things smell bad, or you can't have tractors on the yard, and right to farm laws are basically these guideline protections. And it's not really something that's settled, meaning it's not something that is everywhere. I was just in a county for some personal things, and they were like, hey, we just started putting, whenever a new homeowner comes into the county, they get a pamphlet saying like, hey, here's the right to farm law. These farmers have been here, you can't ask them to do certain things. That's important, particularly CAFOs, confinement animal feeding operations. So first off, CAFO is something that's kind of become weaponized, but what it is, it's a defined statutory term from Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. So that's really, it's a term that has come up a lot in like movies or the documentaries or in the books, but it's a defined term, environmental law term from the Clean Water Act. And basically, once a animal operation reaches a certain size, scale, or environmental impact, they have to do an NPDES permit. And part of that permit is a regulatory process which allows public comment, and farmers can, or neighbors or community members, anyone who could say they were going to be harmed can say, hey, we don't want this CAFO here, or we don't want this, this thing here that would be get a permit. So that's another great thing, I think, to share is right to farm, and then just the commenting process. Pennsylvania is unique because they have an environmental hearing board, which kind of is similar to like a statewide it's a judiciary specifically for these types of issues. And this is some of the work I worked on at Chesapeake Bay Foundation with this kind of stuff. So that might be interesting. I don't know the opposite. So I try to, maybe that's more of a local focus. If you want to flip it, I mean, anyone who cares about agriculture needs to care about the Farm Bill. This thing that comes around every 5 years that does your crop insurance funding, your conservation funding, EQIP, ASEP, farmland preservation dollars. I mean, a lot of people don't even know how farmland preservation works, and does the funding come from state, local? I think the Farm Bill is great. And then one of the things that life has kind of shown me is, like, I think growing up, all of us wanted to be associated with USDA or PEO, the Department of Ag, but really the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, and then the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, they have the largest tools at their disposal to impact agriculture in a lot of ways, because those are really the regulatory officials, whether you're using the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, other type of structures, or in FDA's case, they're the ones who look at animal drugs and feed. Also, any sort of food safety recalls, that's also done through FDA. So they, other than slaughter facilities and carcass inspections, that's a USDA area, plus catfish. But even like shellfish and seafood, that's all FDA. So I wish someone had told me when I was young, like, hey, EPA and FDA are really a place that you could go and make a real impact if you do want to do government service, because those are the places that kind of have that gap between understanding how farms work, but also trying to enforce these statutes that have real impact. That would be another thing I could think of. And also, I know we're always in a job employment business. There's a real demand for STEM students, people, chemists, people who are interested in doing biotech for the next gen pesticides, next gen microbials. There's some really exciting stuff in that space. A lot of times folks go into that area and go off from agriculture, but there's some really great work in ag that needs to be done, that I think that would be wonderful to teach young people to be encouraged about, is that, hey, sky's the limit. We need folks. It doesn't just have to be on the farm. It could be anywhere in the supply chain.
Thank you. That's super helpful.
Is it Melanie? Is that, sorry, am I saying it wrong? Okay. Hi, Melanie. Sorry. Zach Gihorsky. You didn't miss too much. I just gave them a little bit of my background. And I was just sharing a little bit about what I do. And now we're just having some conversations about if there's something I can help you with in terms of, I'm an ag lobbyist here in DC, but I focus on climate and environmental work. So whether that be what can help you in the classroom, or career opportunities for students, or how maybe how to build coalition work or be engaged in your own community, or however I can be helpful.
Great. Apologies for being late. My computer's restarted a couple times in the last 10 minutes and it's still working pretty slow. So
I don't know if y'all are like that,
yeah,
but the pandemic made you learn how to restart your computer religiously, because it was a problem if you didn't. Trying to think of some other.
So what would be advice you would give to a student who is interested in working in any sort of government, like local government or beyond?
I'd highly encourage it. Public service is a great honor. I'll be honest, I was raised the kind of traditional small town kid who has a healthy distrust of government. But my time in Pennsylvania Department of Ag changed my life. Really, like, I work with some exceptionally talented professionals who could have done other things, but they really felt like service was big and mattered. I work with some great vets, some great public health officials, and I think it really is great. It's also wonderful for young people to get great job experience. The private sector, I think, has a lot of pressure on folks immediately because of like the ROI component, but government kind of has a natural built-in opportunity to grow and learn on the job. I can tell you like in Washington, if you have government experience, whether you worked at a state level or federal level, both in the executive branch or on the Hill, your career outcomes, your salary outcomes are almost double. Yeah, it's really significant to be able to say, I understand how a regulatory role. And let me give you maybe a very good practical example. When I went to NASDA, you would think NAS, the National Association of Departments of Ag, would have a lot of alumni of state departments of ag. I was the only person on the policy team that ever worked state department of ag. And mainly because people in Washington want Washington folks. But I was the only person that had experience on being a regulator and understanding how that worked. So it's a unique, it's an easy way to set yourself apart. And I would highly encourage it at all levels. There's even, in the legal world, county solicitors even matter, right? Because a lot of your water actions or environmental actions or these land use cases, being a county solicitor is one of those roles that can matter. And there's just a lot of really cool opportunities. And I was lucky in my role, I got to travel a lot too, which was nice. I got to see all of Pennsylvania. That was a wonderful opportunity too. Yeah, I couldn't speak about it enough. It's weird. I'm the only person in my office who did not write a farm bill. I'm the only person who's not been on the federal Hill and done that. So it's a great experience and people really value it.
Zach, what are some of the hot button issues right now that in the environmental group, and it's not to say that environmentalists are wrong in their concerns, pushing for political or legal action that is affecting positively or negatively the agricultural community, that you're sort of involved with, lobbying for, mitigating, and so on?
Yeah, so there's a lot. So let's talk about one that's really prominent: diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So which our organization's engaged on. I was heavily engaged on it at NASDA, but you always have this tension, right? So if we agree that methane digesters on dairy farms are incredibly valuable because they mitigate methane, which is one of these tier 1 greenhouse gases that has an impact on climate change, right? Well, the largest dairy farms are the ones that you'd want to give cost share funding so that they can have these digesters to have the largest reduction in greenhouse gas. But it is often the case of environmental groups, and I have no opinion on this being right or wrong, that they would rather that funding go to small and beginning farmers for a variety of different reasons. And that funding would not be available to the larger producers, right? So like that is a natural tension between the two. Are we going to try to give the funding to those who may need it most? They're the most underserved. I think that's a really good term. Or are we going to try to give the funding to the folks who have the greatest impact, right? So I think that's one of these really hot button issues that we're going to really have to look at in the next farm bill is like, hey, do you want climate impacts from those who have the largest impact on climate? Or do you want to help those who need the help the most? Because they're not necessarily the same group. And I think that's something we all have to figure out. Climate change generally is a huge one, right? How are we measuring, verifying, and mitigating and providing opportunities for people to, one really cool area that intersects, and this was something I recently learned in the last 4 or 5 years, or at least had a greater understanding, was the connection of forest and farming. Because forests have been something the environmental groups have always touted and have always been big. And I know when I was at Chesapeake Bay, we started the million, is it a billion trees or however many trees they're trying to plant in Pennsylvania for the Chesapeake, but you have this huge number. Well, most farm owners do have tree as part of it. So we're seeing this rise in silvopasture and things like that. So that's another area I think is getting a lot more pursued, is this intersection between carbon sequestration and forestry and livestock production. And then the livestock production piece, right? So we talked about CAFOs. So for a long time, groups, when I say groups, I'm not picking at any individual. I'll just say who would take the adverse or the opposition against maybe agriculture. It's like, hey, we don't want animal confinement operations, right? But now we're seeing this great research and development about what livestock on grass and in rotational grazing systems can actually do for biodiversity and actually do for some of these big net climate benefits. So now you're having this tension between, we actually know we do want livestock, we just don't want them raised in a certain way. And now you have these efficiency pieces, right? Like, hey, well, raising in this way is less efficient, which raises food costs. And these kind of tensions are all policy issues that we're going to have to tackle.
So Zach, I was kind of curious. So obviously, like for us, like we can go out and like read some like these high level documents and like the Farm Bill and kind of view it for ourselves. Do you have any good resources that kind of break these issues down that you would consider classroom ready? So like, for example, I do like a monthly current event article with all my classes. So is there anything like ready to go that is like current, like what happened this week, like with environmental or ag policy?
Yeah, so and I can say this, John, the Congressional Research Service, they're great because they just do objective pieces. Because I can think of some really good books that are short and have great grasp, but to be honest, they're kind of opinionated because the author has an opinion. And they'd be great for like us, but for students, they may kind of skew. But the Congressional Research Service, like the Inflation Reduction Act, the big law that was passed through reconciliation that the Democrats pushed through, that had $20 billion in conservation funding, which will help the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, ASEP, the Farmland Preservation Program. They put out a 3-pager that was like, this is how the money's going to get spent, and this is who's going to be able to benefit from it. They also did one on the it's not African American farmers in this one, because that one got caught up in court, but I think it's underserved farmers. They put a few $1 billion out to help folks who are in delinquency in their farm loans. They did one of those too. The Library of Congress hosts a Congressional Research Service, and they have folks who are just farm researchers or ag researchers, and they put out these great couple-page documents. And they do one every Farm Bill. That one's a little bit bigger. I think it's 10 to 12 pages, but it'll literally go through each title and say, hey, this is the funding, this is who it helps, and this is the agency that administers it. Actually, my ag law class that Brooke Dewar taught, that's what we used, was like our, here, go read this so you kind of know where the class is going to go. And I thought that was fantastic. I'm trying to think. Too. It's weird too, because PA has its own farm bill too, right? So that's the other thing that y'all are unique, is how do you not confuse young folks like, hey, there's this omnibus that happens in Washington that goes down, and then there's state legislation too. Yeah, the federal program has a lot of that kind of stuff. And I'll think of some other resources. There has to be USDA does have a lot of really good stuff. I know, like even for co-ops, they have like a whole website dedicated just to cooperatives, of these businesses that are farmers that come together to form co-ops. And I thought that was really cool, which is a great part of history and whatnot. So they do have some really good resources there, and they're making themselves available a lot faster. Again, I just always kept caution people. There are certain things that are just political, because the office in which puts it out is, Build Back Better, things like that, like the Biden administration, they do that stuff. Sometimes it's not that big of a deal because it's still just factual, but it'll be wrapped in a Biden administration or Trump administration wrapper. So, the other one is NIFA, the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. They do a lot of great research. They're the agency at USDA that does Smith-Lever, which gives funding to extension, like Penn State. So they're another great resource there. I have one of my really good friends here in DC works there, and if y'all ever are looking for folks to talk about extension work, he'd be a great resource. He's a Pennsylvania person from Sullivan County. Let me see here. IRA. Darla, I just dropped in the chat. This was the most recent, what is a farm bill and the graphs and stuff. 3 pages, very simple. I think this is as succinct as you're going to get, you know, in terms of how the funding works and, you know, just a general piece. You know, you can take it to another level, but that's kind of a good place to start, I think. If I can ask, what kind of interest are y'all hearing from young folks? Or is it folks who want to, you know, run for office and like to be, you know, impact ag? Is it people who want to go back to the farm? Is it people who, I know in my friend circle, I found a lot of folks who like want to have a more of a traditional career like we have, but they also want to be involved in production in their nights and weekends, but they want to kind of do it in a more sustainable way. Like they want to do specialty crops, or they want to do organic, you know, beef, or they want to, you know, they want to, you know, provide value add. I'm just kind of curious what interest is these days, because it's changed so much even in the 10 years. I mean, I remember, you know, so many folks I went to school with were just going home to milk or you know, do, you know, whatever. And now, you know, folks are interested in, you know, I had a friend the other day who wants to do bok choy. Like, I mean, just these crazy cool. I mean, they're neat, but it's totally different in just a few years.
So Zach, you know where Cumberland Valley is, that
Yep.
we're very suburban, close to Harrisburg. We have a lot of students really interested in like the communications, marketing, and then particularly food science and biotechnology have kind of taken off in our area. It's pretty obvious that houses are swallowing up farmland here. So students have realized if they want to be involved in production agriculture, they do need to kind of move or have that resource. But we've kind of gone again, just agricultural literacy, like promoting what the industry is, but they need to get an understanding of how diverse it is first before they go and share that story with others. That's kind of where our program's at.
Yeah, that's actually really helpful. I was in Iowa 3 months ago, and they were really upset about $3,000 an acre of farmland, right? And obviously, you know, yeah, I mean, we're just in a different world here, right? So, and you know, ag's a community thing, right? So it's easy to tell a young person like, hey, are you willing to go to Iowa to start? Because $100,000 can get you X. But you know, one of the benefits of that our community is the markets. But farmland preservation is one of the few ways to get equity in for young folks who want to transition in, right? I mean, Maryland has a great program where if you're a new and beginning farmer with less than 10 years of experience, they'll actually put your farm into an easement for fast track it. They'll do it in 6 months for a young person to use that money to put down on the farm. It's one of the few ways that young people can kind of enter in, but it is that's really, really, really tough. And that's something we are trying to work on. There was a few $1 billion in the IRA for farmland preservation, but and Pennsylvania's leading that, but it's just it's still so hard when the land values are so high. Like Bucks County, like where we went to school, preserved land and non-preserved land are basically par. Sorry, a little bit of this is me processing, because these are policy things that I think we need to still improve. And I'm always trying to listen to what y'all are hearing, because I feel like we need to have better conversations of how do we fix that. One idea that came up in Iowa was affirmative easements, where you use, this is a law tactic, so what I'm talking to you is you can literally put a restriction on land that you can only do cattle on grass or native grass, or you can put these, what they call affirmative easements. You can do only specialty crop. You can't just put horses out there for say, like that could be a restriction, no horse production, only human food consumption animals. And that would dramatically reduce the price of the land, because only people interested in producing food in a certain way would want to do that. That's one tool, but that's not something we've ever done at a large scale. So those are some neat little quirks. Sorry, I'm just making some notes too.
So my area is pretty different than Cumberland Valley. Melanie and I are in the northern region of Pennsylvania. So I'll speak for Bradford County, but we have a lot of people who are, have grandparents who have farms, but we're losing a lot of farmland up here, but not even to production, more for like natural gas, or just they can't sustain their farm, like they have to get another job and maybe kind of farm on the side. But my students, like have no idea at all about laws relating to agriculture. Like, we don't talk about it at all. We don't address it in school. And I know that their parents probably don't talk about it. So I know that I just need to introduce them to it and help them understand that we need people who understand agriculture, who are good at communicating and willing to fight for us. We have a pretty active farm bureau, so I think that kind of helps. But the majority of my students like enjoy being outdoors, but not many of them truly live on a functioning full-time farm.
Sarah Beth, is the Troy Fair in Bradford County?
Yes, sir.
Sorry,
You're fine.
it's terrible that that's how I remember folks. Well, one cool exercise or thought I have is one of the other big policy areas that we're talking about, and because you brought up natural gas, is solar panels. So
That's huge.
in the Mid-Atlantic New England region, you're really seeing this real tension where solar companies that, because of this big push for renewables, are coming in and buying ag land, and because they can pay more than what the builders can do, and you're taking land out, this premium ag land out of production and putting it into solar panels. I think there's a really cool, I don't have it designed, but you could pull a really cool exercise, because that problem actually touches on some really interesting fundamental principles, right? So farmers have traditionally been huge advocates of private property rights, very understandable. But so you want farmers to be able to sell, land however they see fit. But then you have a government that's incentivizing renewables. Again, no judgment there, but they've put the incentive system isn't like, hey, we're going to put it on the Department of Energy, or we're going to put it on dairy barns, or we're going to put it on prisons, like, or any government space that, or large space that isn't tillable, arable land. And then also the value of bringing those solar panels up and being able to farm underneath of them. Solar farms who just have pollinator gardens, or maybe they put out a half dozen sheep and then they get the tax assessment as ag use. Like, is that really the kind of tax system that you would want? Like, I think those are all fun things to play around with how young folks, their natural instincts and how they see these conflicts of tensions between these different things would be interesting.
Yeah, that would definitely be an interesting conversation. We were just at a breakfast with Senator Yaw, and he was talking too about, protections for in, 40, 50 years when these solar panels aren't usable anymore, like what is going to happen to them, because they should not be just going into a landfill, but are they able to be recycled, that sort of thing. So that's kind of interesting too.
Sarah Beth, is Bradford County in the Chesapeake Bay? I know Darrell isn't, but are you in the Chesapeake Bay region too?
So we are right at, we have the Chemung and the Susquehanna River right in our area. So we're at the tippy top coming in there.
It is one of these fundamental environmental law issues. Like, it is something everyone talks about. The TMDL, it is a fascinating thing. Like, if you read the Third Circuit's opinion that Judge Rambo, who's a Dickinson Law alum, wrote, that American Farm Bureau failed, they didn't even get, they lost on summary judgment, that this is even outside the scope of EPA's jurisdiction. They're basically trying to take what was supposed to be guidance, this is where you guys should go, this should be the goals, now trying to enforce it as basically a regulatory piece. I was at the University of Maryland's Rye Farm this past week with a bunch of folks, and everyone, Pennsylvania is the elephant in the room, right? And how does that impact folks? How do you look at how farmers who've been doing the right thing for a very long time, now they don't have any opportunity to get credit because they've been doing things? How do we, we started this benchmark here, but there are folks that already made reductions. You have a legislature that's not funding some of the practices that you need. This is a national, because they're going to use this TMDL model in Chesapeake and enforce it in the Gulf and in the Ohio River Basin. This isn't the beginning of how groups are going to look at this. When Chesapeake Bay Foundation and its other folks came up with this idea, the silver bullet of upholding EPA to have this public corpus of the Chesapeake and having to use the Clean Water Act to save the bay and things like that. And again, no judgment, because the bay is a beautiful thing and it's a great resource and has a huge economic thing. But this is a pressing issue of our time. This is not, oh, it's cute, or it's it'll go away. No, this is something we're going to be constantly hearing about. And it's hard because you have a dairy farm in your county who has no direct connection to the person in the Chesapeake, and vice versa. The person who lives down here in Annapolis doesn't know that farmer, but they are connected in a environmental way, and that shared corpus of a good environment, a good water system, things like that. So, and on the regulatory side, ag gets all the crap, but construction, stormwater. If you think ag has a strong lobby, you should see the Builders Association down the street, because that building is like there's a million construction exceptions and ways to get out of reporting and small. So that's a problem too, is the construction stormwater runoff for sure.
Zach, just out of curiosity, does that happen to be Associated Builders and Contractors Incorporated?
I was talking about the Home Builders Association,
okay.
but I think they're an affiliate member too. So yeah, it's the Home Builders also does the Waters of the U.S. Coalition down here too, because that's another big area, is where does the federal jurisdiction over navigable waters of the U.S. connect to the state jurisdiction, like, because Pennsylvania has its own Clean Streams Act and all that kind of stuff. So these are all really cool things. But I'm also always curious. Like, I mean, I'll be honest. I didn't really feel like I had it took me a long time to kind of get it figured out in my life. I worked full time when I first went to school, like trying to just get my life together. So I can't imagine what a high school student is in terms of just trying to, make it interesting, but also, like, I mean, the law is hard for anyone at any point in their life because it's not written to be consumable by folks. So I'm curious what level of engagement I will say that, but I also had classmates who, like, they're 7th generation attorney, and they knew they wanted to be a lawyer since they were like in 7th grade. So I know those folks exist. They just were not in my world. My mom didn't finish high school, so this has all been kind of crazy for me. But it's great that you have folks who are just interested in environmental stuff generally, because that was not always connected to ag. And I think it's great that we are trying to build a bridge between that.
I kind of have a question on that. Like, for these large, like, farm bills that are like hundreds of pages, how do you
Sure.
how do you read that? How do you become like comfortable with that?
So a couple things, right? So the history of the Farm Bill, right? So that green book there is basically the history of the Farm Bill when you go back to the 1945 Farm Act. So the reason you have a Farm Bill every 5 years is because it's an omnibus sunsetted bill that if you don't pass it in time, it gets kicked back to these 1949 provisions. And a lot of them are from the New Deal. If you really go back to like when the beginning of the agency, it never really had regulatory authority until the New Deal. It used to be just a research, the People's Department, blah, blah, blah. But the short answer to your question, we all work in teams, right? So one, if you ever come down here, your congressperson, your senator, they're just a figurehead. I don't mean them to be mean or disrespectful, but the 24-year-olds run Washington. All these staffers who work on the Hill, they run Washington, which should terrify you. Every Supreme Court decision is written by a kid, so it should be terrifying. Yeah, and most of them go to very fancy schools that are far away from rural America too, by the way. And some of them are exceptionally good people. So I don't want to make that disparaging, but you should have that kind of knowledge. But basically, you become experts in your policy area, and you know what provisions of the Farm Bill affect that area. So as a team, you're able to work together to kind of piece it all together. So when a bill like that comes out, basically, if you're in an office, they chop it into 100-page swaths and give you, Darla, you're going to do crop insurance. Sarah Beth, you're going to do conservation. Melanie, you're going to do miscellaneous. Zach, you're going to do horticulture, which has specialty crop. And then you review it, you go through it kind of at piece. That's the way you tackle it for sure. And then there are exceptional people who, if you work through multiple ones, you've pivoted around, you may have a really good depth of knowledge. The interesting thing is too, I think is important to know, is Sarah Beth, is like you have Gen Council, you have like Ledge Council who actually like drafts it, but then you have policy folks or the people actually come up with the concepts and the changes and tell Ledge Council what they need to do, which is one of the things I always, when I go back to Dickinson and students always ask me like, oh, do you ever wish you like traditionally practice law? And I said, I think my job is so much cooler because I get to tell lawyers what to do, which is fun in its own little way. Because they're more just trying to figure out the math of, okay, this is the language we need to use because if it goes to court. I will say the courts matter. I mean, I think that's something that gets kind of lost. We always think about USDA or the Hill, but like I said, 2 weeks ago, these 3 blocks from here, the United States Supreme Court heard Proposition 12, California Department of Agriculture versus National Pork Producers. The people of California voted to get rid of confinement, hog operations, no more pork raised in farrowing crates, and then are requiring states that sell pork into California to meet that same standard. This is one of the first dormant commerce clause cases heard in 100 years, and it's going to have a huge impact on that. So I mean, it's really cool and neat, and there's strong arguments on both sides. That's why the Supreme Court is, the people of California should have a say in how they want their food raised, and but should they have the ability to demand that of folks outside the state? And so we'll see how that gets decided. But I mean, these are pressing issues that are happening right in front of us today. For those of you who geek out, the Supreme Court is open to anyone to hear cases. So if you're ever down or if you want to bring students, it's a really neat experience. It's very inspirational for people to have that experience.
Zach, speaking of experiences, another just curious question. As you and I were communicating and mapping out when exactly we could hold this, you mentioned, and for all of you attending, the reason we're abandoning the typical 3:30 to 4:30 model is Zach had a call with the White House right before this. Just curious, like what level of officials in the White House do you interact with on those calls, and
Sure.
sort of what does that whole aspect of your job sort of look like?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the people there are ag officials in the White House that I typically interact with. So the call I was just recently on was a rural stakeholders call, specifically looking at the payments going out to farmers who are delinquent, the minority farmer debt relief, and then also some forestry provisions that were passed in the Inflation Reduction Act. Small group of folks that try to get together every month. It's funny I don't know if y'all have people in your life who you text and try to get a hold of, and they're always like, "Oh, I'm just too busy." I'm always like, the White House returns my calls faster than you. And it's legitimately, there are folks who are just so frustrating, but the public servants here are wonderful. My boss, Chuck Connor, was President Bush's White House advisor for agriculture. He served 8 years in the White House. But basically his job was to advise the president if his Secretary of Ag was doing a good job. To kind of be that value added person. That's probably the highest level of White House official in agriculture you're going to get, unless you go back to no one would know this, but Secretary Wallace, who's probably the most famous Secretary of Ag historically in Farm Bill culture, was FDR's vice president after he had been Secretary of Ag, and then he became FDR's vice president. He was an Iowa row cropper, really revolutionary man in ag history. And then when you go to the individual agencies, like EPA has a person called the agricultural advisor to the administrator. The administrator is the cabinet level official for the EPA. That gentleman currently is Rod Snyder. I text Rod, call Rod every week. We have great discourse, and he was someone who's put in the law and statute that position to advise the environmental regulator, the administrator, on agriculture. And then at USDA, they're much more, I don't interact with Secretary Vilsack on a regular basis, though I go to a lot of events with him. But I get coffee with the deputy secretaries and folks like that, and they have intergovernmental affairs folks. And that's not a testament to me. I am the person you see here is the culmination of a lot of wonderful things that have happened because people, have helped my career. But that is because the organizations I work with, or the the great relationships that agriculture has in its community. So, and I say that because if you ever are interested in a career change later in life, we would, we need more ag focused people in Washington, and in Harrisburg. So I know I always say DC, but your state legislatures need it too, for sure. And on that note too, I always say make sure you engage your local officials, because you never know where their future is going to hold. Madeline Dean, who had been a state legislator in Pennsylvania, she's now a congresswoman, and she's part of the January 6th committee. Like, I just say that as an example of, like, you may think of someone as just someone or they're a local person, but you don't know what their trajectory is going to go. I mean, one of the cool things about working at NASDA was I got to see kind of what it takes to become a U.S. Secretary of Agriculture or a Deputy Secretary, because I was behind the scenes able to see like how the nominating process goes and how ag organizations put people's names forward. And anyone who follows this kind of stuff, like Secretary Redding's name was floated around for some high-level positions, and other secretaries who I know. The secretary in Delaware, Michael Skuse, was the DepSec, the number 2 at USDA under the Obama administration. And these are people who you probably have been on a grain trawl with or been at a county fair with, and next thing you know, they're one of the most important people in all of ag policy. So that's important. I think those professionalism skills are great to teach young folks that, like, hey, these are people who are going to be in your life a long time, so make sure you're always respectful and stuff like that.
Okay, well, Darla had to jump for another meeting. We have 13 more minutes of scheduled time. If anybody has any other questions for Zach, or Zach, anything else that you'd like to share, please all feel free to do so. But as Dr. Foster likes to say, this is also not a hostage situation. We all have busy schedules and lives. So if everybody has asked what they'd like to ask, and if Zach has covered everything he intended to, we can wrap up a little bit early, but please ask away if you still have anything.
Let me know. Sorry, Melanie. Yeah.
No, I think I'm good. I was gonna say, I apologize. I turned my camera off to try to get better feed to come through for a while, but everything that Sarah Beth said about just kind of the perspective of our students from up here is definitely helpful. But my students do a lot with like Envirothon stuff too, and sometimes they end up getting into some of those environmental regulations, or the special topic of the year might involve more about that. So it is interesting to see them process through like governmental documents or scientific documents. And I think you gave some helpful tips, so I appreciate that.
Well, if I can ever, I can't think of Adam's last name, but one of the teachers at Conrad Weiser's had me speak to his group a couple times over the years. If I can ever, if you guys ever have a career day or something like that, I'm always happy, especially now that Zoom's a thing. I used to drive up there all the time, but if I can ever be a resource, and I not to say I wouldn't come to class, it may just take some longer term planning. I do a lot of livestock judging in PA and New Jersey, so a lot of times I can kind of make a trip out of things, but like I said, I'm the product of a lot of people who've helped me on my journey. So if I can ever be a resource, I was the token kid who thought he was going to graduate high school and go back to the farm. And if I hadn't had some maybe family politics stuff happen, I probably never would have gone to college. So, it was a big deal for me. If I can ever, let people know that, this is all attainable, whatever you want to do, you can do it. And that, frankly, in my lifetime, that the word environmental is a good word. It's not a bad word. I know a lot of folks, in my generation think it was a bad word. These folks trying to get rid of family farms. I don't really feel like that. They just, need some education or we need to bend too. I always tell it to people, we all got to grow. The world's changing. It's part of life. So thank you. I know everyone's time is really valuable.
Well, no, thank you very much, Zach. I know, you've got a lot of high level stuff you're handling there, and thank you for carving out this hour. And thank you to Sarah Beth, Melanie, and Darla, even though she's not with us anymore, for spending this hour as well.
I'll drop my LinkedIn in the chat, and if y'all feel free to add me if you'd like, or Jonathan has my contact information. But like I said, I'm always happy to be a resource, and thank you for what you do. I didn't really talk about, like, I did my student teaching at Saul, and to be frank, I thought there was more politics in teaching than there was in politics. So I just give you guys all the credit in the world. My FFA advisors changed my life, and I can't say enough about it. So I really do think you're doing the most incredible thing. And I know you may not be able to see the lives that you touch every single day, but I'm someone who benefited from their teachers. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for
Absolutely.
what you're doing and fighting the good fight in DC, because we need a lot of people who understand agriculture. So thank you.
I'll let y'all get on with it. Jonathan, thank you. Sarah Beth, Melanie, it was a pleasure.
All right. Thank you very much again, Zach and Sarah Beth and Melanie. And I will see both of you actually tomorrow night. So see you then. All right.